In that case, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Timothy Hampton. I'm the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at UC Berkeley. And I'm happy to welcome you to the first of our online versions of the Berkeley Book Chat series, in which a faculty member from Berkeley's humanities community discusses a recently published book. Given the format of the Zoom platform, we'll feature a conversation between myself and our guest for about a half an hour or so before opening it up for questions on the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform. This is being recorded and will be available on the Townsend Center website soon. Today, our guest is Professor Oliensis, the chair of the Department of Classics at Berkeley and a scholar of classical Latin literature. Her most recent book is called Loving Writing, Ovid's Amores, published by Cambridge University Press. It offers an original and compelling exploration of the love poetry of the Roman poet Ovid, or Publius Ovidius Naso, as he was called. Ovid, we know, is one of the most influential poets in the Western tradition, indeed in all of world literature. It would be impossible to imagine our poetic tradition without Ovid. And it's a delight, therefore, to read this important reconsideration of his love poetry, which, as we know, was massively influential for later poets. So Nellie, let me welcome you to the book chat and thank you for agreeing to talk today about your work. Perhaps we could begin by me asking you to tell us about this particular corpus of Ovid's poetry. It's very influential, but it's not the most famous of his work. When we think of Ovid, we usually think of the Metamorphoses, but the Amores are important as well. And maybe you could just describe this and kind of place it a little bit in Ovid's corpus for us.
Yeah, sure. It's a more complicated question than it might seem to be, but I can give a simple answer to it. So the Amores is Ovid's first collection of poetry. This we know, it's the first thing that he came out with. Preceding the Metamorphoses by, well, that's hard to say, but I'm just going to make it up and say about 20 years, let's say. And the reason the question is a little complicated is so it's the first thing he writes, the first work in his elegiac corpus and his corpus of love poetry, which is followed by things like the Heroides, poems impersonating mythological heroines, and the Ars Amatoria, very well known, and his other things. But anyway, so it's the first sort of selection in his love poetry, but what makes it a little complicated is that the collection is headed by an epigram that tells us that the collection we are reading, the 3-book collection we are reading, is a second edition of what was originally a 5-book edition. This is produced, there's a huge amount of scholarship around this. What did the missing 5-book collection look like? And I'm completely agnostic on the question of what it looked like, whether there even was a 5-book collection, because the epigram, that little introductory epigram, does so much wonderful work for the collection that follows. Some scholars think it's, there was nothing preceding it. In any case, what this means, though, is that the chronology, not only because of the epigram, but also because of some poems within the collection that seem to point to later moments or later collections, the chronology of the Amores is very hard to pin down. So on the one hand, it's his first work, and on the other hand, it isn't his first work. Okay. Right. So, yeah, there's that.
So how did you get into working on this stuff?
Yeah. So I have been kind of working my way backwards through Ovid now for about 20 years, I would say. So I started with the Exile Poetry, actually, which I read on an airplane flying to California, in fact, at one point. I got obsessed with the Exile Poetry, then I moved back in time to the Metamorphoses, and finally I moved back to the Amores. And for many contingent reasons, I mean, this project, might have been something else, but I think with the Amores, I think the reason I ended up actually committing myself to writing a book on the Amores is that I don't know quite how to put this, but I felt that my pleasure in the Amores, or my experience in the Amores, was not registered for the most part, in existing scholarship. And it's always hard to say because I'm a huge fan of the existing scholarship on the Amores, which does all kinds of fabulous things. You know, it's just full of brilliant work, but it just didn't match up with with how I felt the Amores. So I kind of wanted to write a book that was more located in my own pleasure.
That's great. I mean, that's the only reason to write a book, right? Is because there's a space in your own experience there that hasn't been filled up by the relevant or existent criticism. So that's great. It's great to hear that. So could we talk a little bit about the persona of the Amores? So there's this guy called Naso, or Naso. I assume it's pronounced Naso, though I think W.S. Gilbert rhymes it with say so in one of his lyrics in Iolanthe. So, but we'll call him Naso for the purpose of argument. So he's there. He's this kind of strange character who's a kind of double of the author, but he's not a double of the author. In fact, he's much more disruptive in some way than most poetic personae. Could you talk a little bit about how he works?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, for me, this is a very important kind of point, okay, which I spend maybe too much time harping on the book. Yeah. But, and the way I have to say, it's a little bit paradoxical because my first book, which was about Horace, made a huge deal of the fact that it's kind of, there are big problems with an absolute differentiation between the author and his persona. You know, I was pushing to reunite Horace with his persona, whereas in this book, I'm doing exactly the reverse. I'm really trying to demarcate, you know, a very strong distinction between Ovid and this character I'm calling Naso. But the reason for that is that I'm doing that and then I undo that gesture in the second half of the book. This is a roundabout answer to the question. Feel free to come back and tell me I have completely respond to you. But there is a tendency, because of various features of the Amores, there is a tendency, which is very natural and justifiable, to draw a very sharp distinction between the poet of the collection and the lover of the collection. And the lover is this scandalous, ridiculous, dreadful, you know, ludicrous character with whom we do not want to associate the author Ovid. Whereas the poet is a poet, and therefore we automatically want to associate him with the poet Ovid. And my sense about this is that what happens in the scholarship, again, understandably and justifiably, and this is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, it's not what I want to do, is that scholars tend to give the poet a free pass. In other words, when the narrator, the character within the Amores is acting like a poet, he tends, this is a generalization, not entirely true, but he tends to be treated as a representative of Ovid and to be kind of dignified by that association. Whereas the lover, of course, has nothing to do with Ovid and is this scandalous character. So the reason I'm interested in Naso, using that name, is precisely that I use the name Naso for the poet. In other words, for me, it's hugely important that the poet in the collection be not identified with Ovid so that we have the license to recognize his more problematic attributes. So I'm very interested in putting the poet and the lover back together, since after all, this is one character across the Amores. It's not like there are two different people running around the collection. There's one person running around the collection, and to me, it's really important that he's the same character throughout.
Right. And you also don't have the kind of temporal distinction between the poet and the you don't have a kind of narrative the way you do in Dante, where Dante the pilgrim is not the same as Dante the poet, right? I mean, it's more complicated. I've just received a message from one of my colleagues that I should remind those of you out there in Zoom land that you can type in questions through the Q&A function of the Zoom platform, and we'll ask Nellie these questions at the end of the conversation. So feel free to do that. So that's great. I mean, I think that's I have to say that reading this book, and I'd read the Amores because they're pretty influential in areas that I work in, but I had not read them particularly closely. And I have to say, it was entering into your book was almost like entering into a kind of labyrinth, because we have this kind of initial sort of close analysis of the poems and sort of things that are going on. And then as we move on and on in your reading, which is quite compelling, and I don't want to, it's a bit of a page turner, I have to say. The analysis gets more and more complicated, and Naso's relationship to Ovid becomes more and more complicated, and his relationship to the woman, Corina, becomes more and more complicated, and more issues start to enter into your reading. Questions of sexuality, questions of violence, castration, eunuchs pop up here and there, masochism. I mean, it gets wilder and wilder as the story goes on, and really, by the time we get to the end, at least by the time I got to the end of the book, I mean, I was just reading the poems in a completely different way. So it was really quite compelling in that regard. So could you talk a little bit about the sex? There's sex all over the place. Somebody asked me, a colleague asked me if it was going to be appropriate for his teenage son to watch this event. And I said I thought that it probably was. But could you just give us an idea of the way in which sexuality works in the collections?
Okay, that's, yeah.
It's a big question.
Yeah. So what's interesting,
it seems to be tied into reading a lot, right?
Yeah. Yes. So what's interesting to me is that I agree. I mean, sexuality is kind of everywhere. You know, this book is like sort of eroticized from start to finish. But what's interesting is there's actually not a whole lot of sex in this book. I mean, there isn't, you know, if you compare the Ars Amatoria, which actually has some passages about, you know, giving advice on things like appropriate sexual positions for women to assume depending on their physique, you know, and that really goes, like, talks about things that in case there are young people in the audience, I probably shouldn't mention. But the Amores, there's not much sex. I mean, there's not much sexual action in the Amores, but this does not mean that the poems are not sexual. So this is also something that I'm kind of interested in, especially in the second half of the book, where I shift my attention. Okay, if I can back up a second. In the first half of the book, basically, I'm trying to take the poet down,
right,
and show that his poetic ambitions are tied up with a lot of unsavory emotions like envy, like competition, especially with his girlfriend, which is strange in some ways. Anyway, so I'm kind of taking the poet down. In the second half of the book, I'm trying to promote the lover, which is a difficult endeavor in some ways, by thinking about these issues around sort of his peculiar form of eroticism, which I associate with masochism in a couple of different registers, one more particular, like, you know, soccer maso, that masochism, the whips and chains variety.
And you work through that. You work through the soccer maso connection there.
Yeah.
In a nice
I mean,
way.
I find it very suggestive. I just find, especially Deleuze's account of soccer maso, just suggestive for reading Ovid. I'm just struck by, you know, how the various ways in which the Amores play according to that same style. And then at the end of the book, I'm interested in masochism in this more fundamental sense, the kind of La Planche version of masochism, which has to do with sexuality as such, and with sort of a fundamental intrusion of something alien and this kind of mode of agitation, which seems to me, I don't know if this is making any sense, this is very compressed, but it seems to me very much where the Ovidian project is. And at that point, I don't really mind saying the Ovidian project. You know, I don't mind so much giving up the distinction. Toward the end of this book, those two figures, Ovid and Naso, start coming very, very close together, I would say.
Right. Could we say something about the girlfriend? I mean, she puts up with a lot. Corina, her name is, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Could we talk a bit about the kind of sexual politics of this, and are they different from, you know, Catullus? I mean, we have a whole series of these Latin poets who are in love.
Yes.
But it seems to be particularly, I hate to use the word perverse in the case of Ovid, not because there's anything particularly sexually wild going on, as you say. In fact, there's not very much sex at all, but just the way in which she's manipulated throughout the collection seems to me to be very interesting. And she takes on particular forms of agency and is evasive in certain kinds of ways. Could you fill us in a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely true that Ovid is, one in a line, kind of the last in that period in a line of love poets, starting with Tullus, and then we have Propertius and Tibullus and so on, and his representation of Corinna, who is the main named female with whom he associates himself, belongs to that tradition, but also departs from it. And I have to say, here is not an area where I feel that my book has much to contribute. I mean, I'm not knocking my book. I like my book, and I think it has a lot to contribute. But in this particular area, there's been really good work on this theme by a number of scholars, both on thinking about the kind of problematic dimensions of the representation, Ovid's representation of Corinna and of women in general, and of how it relates to the tradition in terms of kind of intensifying it or going over the top with it, and operating therefore perhaps as a kind of expose. I kind of, partly because there's been so much good work on that subject, on the sexual politics of the Amores and of elegy and love poetry in general, in a Roman context, it's not a place that I go. And I guess the other reason I tend not to go there is that I am trying to do this kind of weird thing, especially in the second half of my book, which is find ways of identifying with Naso as a lover. And the more I enter into the zone of sexual politics, the harder that is. You know what I mean? The more difficult that is to do. So one thing I will say about my take on masochism is that it restores some agency, kind of in a perverse way, to Corinna. And I'm not the first person to make this observation either, but insofar as she seems to be a partner in a very stagey game of desire that Naso is inviting her to play with him. So, there's a way that masochism helps me skirt an issue that I feel is a hugely important and almost inevitable way of thinking about the collection, but is one that I'm really trying to avoid so that I can do something else. There's something experimental about that, and anyway, that's all I'll say.
Yeah, well, no, and it's good, but that's a nice move in the book, because it does make it possible for you to go in other places. And there are certain areas, as you know, when you write a book, where you sort of say, I don't want to go there because it's a rabbit hole I'll never get out of, and other people have worked on it. Let's go over here. Yeah. Speaking of rabbit holes, the one thing that most people know about Ovid, of course, is that he was exiled.
Yeah.
You don't seem to have much interest in Ovid's exile, but you do sort of give interesting comments about it. So could you, I could read you a little, I will read you a little bit about it. This is page 133. You say, Ovid's relationship to Augustus, to put the question as vaguely as possible, is a fascinating subject. One that Ovid's eventual exile by the angry emperor renders practically irresistible. For my own part, I take it for granted that Ovid's poetry represents a generalized threat to Augustus, a threat involving nothing so specific as resentment of a given piece of legislation, nor even of the erosion of republican libertas, but diffused across Ovid's oeuvre, most often in the form of a repeated revelation of the fictitious foundations of political authority. We can't stop there. So can you just say a little bit about that? No, this is not a book about Ovid's exile.
Yes.
You have worked on the exile poems.
Yes.
And it's impossible to think about Ovid and his place in the Western tradition or in world literature without thinking about the exile.
Yeah. So Tim, you're going to think I'm recalcitrant. I'm a hopeless interlocutor, because yes, I am interested in the exile, actually, and I've written some about this, and I'm very interested in Ovid's relation to Augustus, and there's been brilliant work on this by, other people to whom I am much indebted, like, Marchesi and Hardy and others. but in this book, I am, okay, let me put it this way. This question of Ovid's relation to Augustus, for many people, is in fact a question that has to be asked about the Amores. Not everyone does. There are many ways people take up the Amores, and that's not one. But I was very proud of myself that I only have one reference to Augustus in my index. I mean, that is actually intentional. In other words, this is yet another place that where I am basically not going. And again, it's not just because other people have done it. You know what I mean? It doesn't need to be done. Someone else has said it. But because the Amores I am trying to read or to present is one that resides inside the kind of strange, fictional, fantastical, eroticized zone that Ovid has made for us. So I am doing my best to keep Augustus out of the picture, and I actually succeeded quite well. And I have to say that when I got my readers' reports back from the press, I thought it might be the case that someone would say, hey, you know, where's Augustus in this? But luckily they didn't. I mean, they didn't feel it as an absence.
Yeah,
So,
well, I didn't feel it as an absence either. I didn't feel it as an absence either, but it's only my sort of natural curiosity and my general sense of, you know, the rest of Ovid that made me ask that question.
Yes, and I will say that the Amores, insofar as they're, you know, of a piece with the Ars Amatoria, which is Ovid's love poetry, is put forth as the alleged reason for his exile, you know, because the immorality of his poetry going against Augustus' whole, you know, so it's a very reasonable thing to be thinking about in the Amores. And yes, one can play them out in that direction. Again, I'm really...
No, that's fine. So I wanted to shift gears a tiny bit. One of the things that I really loved about the book was the way in which it focused on, it began by focusing on questions of form, and it sort of ends by focusing on questions of form. And when we talk, you know, when we talk about poetry, it's very easy for people not to want to talk about questions of form because, you know, they're technical and they're, you know, often dry and so on and so forth. I have to say your discussion of form was not at all dry in this case. Could you talk a little bit, I mean, the collection begins in this really wacky way where we're told that Ovid is busy writing an epic and that it would appear, or rumor has it, that love came and stole one of the feet from his poetry, so he can't write an epic now. So there's kind of massive implications of form. Could you explain that a bit more to us, especially for those of us who are not Latinists?
Okay, yes. I mean, the first poem of the Amores, leaving aside the little, you know, epigram about the second edition, stages this crazy scene where, just as you say, Ovid is writing, you know, hexameter lines, which are the same each, right? It's the meter epic of Homer, Virgil, and so on. When he says, in this amazing moment, he says that resisse Cupido digitur ad quonum surrepuisse pedem. So, you know, Cupid is said to have laughed and stolen a foot from his meter, leaving him with elegiac couplets, because the second line of the couplet is technically a 5-foot line instead of a 6-foot line. So he's stuck with the meter of elegiac poetry, but he doesn't have anything to put in it because he's not in love, and so on. And Cupid then shoots an arrow into him and solves that problem. So what interests me about this poem, everyone is taken by this poem because it's so, you know, such a wild thing to do, but I'm, on the one hand, it has been taken quite properly to signal the priority of poetry over love, since the origin of this collection is not desire exactly. It's a metrical phenomenon, which then has to be filled with something, you know. But on the other hand, I'm interested in the extent to which that moment fictionalizes the poet. Like, so the poet has this weird thing happen to him where Cupid shows up and they have a kind of discussion, or he talks to Cupid and then Cupid says something to him and shoots him with an arrow. So there's a kind of almost epic scene, event, involving the character of the poet. So I'm interested in this scene in two different ways. On the one hand, I'm interested in the way it inverts the conventions of poetry generally by exposing the fact that when you're writing a poem, there's not just some overflow of something that lands into meter, right? It shows you it sort of lets you into the poet's study, on the one hand, and on the other hand, that the poet's study itself becomes kind of part of the fiction. And this is where I want to call that guy in the study. I want to call him Naso and not call him Ovid, so that I can kind of get us to keep in mind the fact that his vicissitudes are at the same level as the erotic antics of him when he's behaving as a lover.
So it is, yeah. No, that's good. That makes sense. Yeah, that makes total sense. So is it the case, are you still there? Yes.
I am, sorry.
Okay, that's right. Is it the case, so I don't want to get too anachronistic here, but I mean, this seems incredibly modern to me. This gesture that form precedes content, or that, but that the poetic self or the writing self is also implicated in that problem, and that you can't separate the two.
Yeah.
It seems to me extremely modern. I mean, I think of in the French tradition, which is the one I know best, the poet Paul Valéry talking about hearing a rhythm in his head out of which one of his most famous poems is generated, right? Mm-hmm. So since we're getting to the end of the hour, could we zoom out a tiny bit, pardon the no pun intended, could we zoom out a tiny bit and think a little bit more about sort of modern analogs here? I mean, there's a lot in these poems that reminds me of Shakespeare. And the strange inverted logic, the impossibility of distinguishing the poet from the lover, the curious games of mirroring and doubling that seem constantly to be happening. Is that your sense as well?
Do you mean Shakespeare in the sonnets?
I'm thinking of Shakespeare in the sonnets, right? Yeah,
because to me, in some ways, I feel as if Shakespeare leaves intact, potentially anyway, what I call the authenticity effect. In other words, it's possible to read the sonnets if you want, as a kind of transcript or artful representation of emotions. Do you know what I mean? Like, you can do that. I'm not saying that they don't want to, but you see, whereas Ovid makes that much harder. And this question about form, I mean, I hadn't really thought about the fact that it's true that my book begins and almost ends with the form of the elegiac couplet. And one thing that, again, you can tell me, Tim, this better than I can, but one thing that is going on in Ovid, which I don't feel in Shakespeare's sonnets with, the sonnet form so much, is the intense eroticization, to use an ugly word, of the elegiac couplet in Ovid, because it's not simply that form comes first, it's that form is actually a medium of sexual energy.
Yeah.
And I actually believe that of the Amores. And I don't feel that in Shakespeare, but I think I might feel it more in the plays than in the sonnets.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, well, certainly in the plays where form is also is often staged. I mean, we think of something like the obvious moment, the moment in Romeo and Juliet, where Romeo and Juliet are seducing each other, and they in fact make a sonnet by putting their hands together and speaking to each other. I mean, would be a perfect example. But you're right, and I mean, there may be sonnet readers out there who have thought more about this than I have, but something about the strange dialectical structure of the sonnet, the way it's constantly turning back on itself and reflecting on itself, seems to take it out of that kind of immediate erotic charge that you seem to be pointing to in Ovid. And that's an interesting connection, given the fact that he's such an influential figure in writing about love. I had other things I wanted to talk about, such as the parrot poem, but we do have a question, and somebody says, what is your take on Ovid, on Amores 1:5?
Okay, well, oh, yes. So Amores 1:5 is probably the most famous single poem in the Amores. It's the poem in which Naso recalls this, siesta where Corinna shows up scantily clad and he tears her clothes off and they have sex. And it's often taken to be the kind of pinnacle of Ovidian eroticism and the kind of quintessence of what the Amores are. This is Ovid, the one who actually, this is the moment, this is the sexiest moment, officially speaking, in the collection. So, part of what I'm trying to do in this book is dethrone 1:5 in the sphere of erotics. I would like to replace 1:5 as the pinnacle of Ovidian eroticism with 1:4, the poem that precedes it, and I can say more about that, in exactly the same way that I would like to dethrone the immortal poet who shows up at the ends of the first and third books. I would like to dethrone that poet, not replace him with the poet of the poems that come before, but at least show how he is the same person as that kind of unpleasant lover. I mean, how his poetic success is founded on the gestures he makes of relegating his girlfriend in the preceding poem. So to me, these are analogous. My desire, my possibly perverse desire to make that gesture. So with 1:5, it's, there have been wonderful things written about that poem, contouring and nuancing the discussion of its supposed direct sensuality, showing that it's actually much more complicated than that. And it's, there's been great work on the poem from that perspective. But for me, the problem with 1:5 is that it's, well, I have no problems with 1:5. Let me just speak more.
But you have things to say about it.
I read the poem as in tandem with 1:4, which is a poem which is nothing but discourse addressed to a girlfriend who's going to be at the same dinner party that Ovid is going to be at, Naso. See, I said Ovid there. That's because it's the lover. I don't mind saying Ovid. If it's the lover, I don't mind saying Ovid. And he's giving her instructions on how to behave at this dinner party where she's going to be there with another man. And to me, the real charge of the Amores, the real erotic energy of the Amores happens in discourse, like in its frustrated, agitated, derailing into discourse, not in this kind of, to me, very bland, fill in the blanks template of super masculine desire, which is 1:5. It's like, look at her breasts, look at her legs, what a nice belly, it's just, you make it up for yourself, guys, basically. I just think it's aberrant and functioning partly as a response to 1:4. So I have about 5 pages on those two poems toward the end of my book, trying to.
No, I love that part. And I have to say, one of the things that also kind of really opened my eyes is the way in which you read poems together. Yeah. And the way in which, I mean, a minute ago, you said the erotic charge is, in the discourse, but also the erotic charge is in the relationship between poems in some kind of way, right? A lot of the ways in which they respond to each other, they reflect on each other.
Yeah.
And in some ways that in itself is quite startling. I mean, it reminded me a little bit of Petrarch, where there's a blank space between the sonnets and stuff happens and we're not quite sure what to make of that. Yes. But in Ovid's case, it seems to be much more deliberate. And as you argue, these poems are really in a kind of dialogic relationship to each other.
Well, I would say, I mean, that with 1:4 and 1:5, you can see, it's not hard to see the relation there because one is frustrated, the other is satisfied, one is night, the other is midday. They play together. But the poems, the pairings I find really most satisfying are the ones that are just crazy, like the second to last poem of the first book is about Corinna. Well, she's not named, but a woman who's lost all her hair and is now bald, using too much hair.
I love that.
It's wacky poem. And then the next poem is Ovid, Naso, saying, I've made it, I'm going to be one of the canonical poets, I'm going to live forever. Those two poems feel completely unrelated. And I have to say, one of the things I get most satisfaction from is showing how they are in fact profoundly connected. So
that's the job of the critic. Yeah. So I think we have time for one more question. We have a question from Kathleen McCarthy, who says, I found really fascinating the way you show Corinna functioning as a kind of rival, creative rival to Naso, as well as a partner in his masochistic game. Can you say more about the implications of these two aspects of how Corinna functions? Not only, we talked about the masochistic part, but she is a kind of rival.
Yes. Yes, this is something, and actually, since Kathleen McCarthy raised the question, I will say that I feel as if this line of thought was inspired by her, because she once asked me, you once asked me, Kathleen, something about, I can't remember what it was now, but something about rival poets, how rival poets not showing, that there really aren't rival poets generally in the collections, and so I thought that was really interesting, and within the world of the Amores, rival poets, or even, well, I'll put it there, rival poets are displaced by the girlfriend who holds the place of a rival, which makes very little sense, in a certain sense, right? Because she's not a poet, although Corinna, of course, is the name of a famous poet, as one of my.
That's a fantastic. I mean, again, it's one of the very strange features of the collection in the Western tradition. I mean, we always have rival poets. I mean, you read the troubadours, there's always a rival, there's either a rival lover or a rival poet, and sometimes both, right? And here there is no rival poet, and she's the rival, and that's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, and she's the rival in this weird sense, and again, going back to the poem about her losing her hair and the poem about Ovid Naso, becoming an immortal poet. I mean, there's a whole play there where it's almost as if his ability to proclaim his canonization depends on her having lost her hair, her being in the zone, this other zone of the feminine, the worldly, the mundane, the perishable, whereas he has entered this completely other world. And that may sound crazy, but I think I demonstrate it in detail. So I don't think that's simply a gratuitous thing to say. And I would say the one exception within the Amores is the figure of Tibullus, potential exception, a senior elegist. And there, interestingly enough, Ovid effectively appears to have no rivalrous emotions at all, although, as has been shown, and as I kind of bulk out someone else's discussion of it, there are residual traces of rivalrous feelings there, but for the most part, it all gets aimed at women, not at men. Really.
Right, yeah. So I think it's probably time for us to wind up. I just want to thank you for taking time to talk to us. It's an extraordinary book. I mean, it seems to me, as someone who works on later poetry in the Western tradition, that there are all kinds of ways now in which we have to go back and reread a lot of lyric, especially thinking about the implications of Ovid's influence for any number of poets, thinking especially in the Renaissance, but even later. So it's a really wonderful exploration. And once again, for those of you out there in Zoom land, it's called Loving Writing, Ovid's Amores by Ellen Oliensis, Cambridge University Press. Run, don't walk to your local online book purveyor and order a copy. It's really great, and it reads easily and wonderfully. So it's really the best kind of literary criticism. And thank you, Nellie, for talking to us, and thanks for writing the book. And I want to tell everybody that we'll be doing this again soon. This is our first online book chat, but now that we seem to have been able to do it, we'll try it again. So stay tuned at the Townsend Humanities Center website for information about further book chats. And thank you again, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Nellie.
Mm.